And I guess my concern is that what we have here is a series of reports that Dr. Ebright has brought out, some of the questioning that I did and others did earlier. We've had a series of reports that date back a good period of time, and yet the changes haven't been made, and so it's a concern. A mistake is one thing. Having a standard operating procedure which is so flawed that you have repeated mistakes is something that I have to agree with the chairman on. That's our problem. And I agree with you, Mr. Kaufman, you don't want to punish somebody who merely makes a mistake. You want them to come forward as quickly as possible and let's fix it. But you got to stop the same mistake happening over and over again. Dr. Ebright, how do we make these reforms happen this time? How do we do that? Because while CDC has to protect the American public from anthrax and other things, our job is to do oversight and make sure that they're doing their job. So how do we make it happen?
I think the two steps that Congress and the administration could follow to reduce the probability that this happens again in CDC's own labs and in the labs that CDC and USDA regulate outside those facilities. The two most important steps are, first, to reduce the number of select agent laboratories. The number of select agent personnel, the volume of select agent research increased by a factor of 20 to 40 over the last decade. That volume of registered individuals, that volume of activity needs to be rolled back to close to the level where it was at the beginning of that increase. That would represent taking the current 1,000 or more than 1,000 select agent labs in the U.S. and reducing it to 50.
All right, now let me ask you a question real quick. High containment, select agent, are those interchangeable terms or are they different?
They're very close to interchangeable.
Okay.
Most select agent research, particularly most research of consequence, is done at biosafety level 3. Biosafety levels 3 and 4 are considered high-level containment.
So your first recommendation is let's back down to 50 instead of 1,000 of these select agent.
Roughly, the increase was a factor of 20 to 40. I would recommend we roll back a factor of 20 to a factor of 40. 1,000 divided by 20 is 50.
Okay.
1,000 divided by 40 is 25.
All right.
So that, I believe, is the single easiest, single fastest, and certainly most economical approach.
And you had a second, because obviously...
Okay, last one is independent entity that carries out the regulation and oversight of biosafety and biosecurity in those labs. Not an agency that performs the work, not an agency that funds the work.
Okay. Now, you said we need to scale back, but let me ask you, why has there been an expansion, and the phrasing that I have is the high containment laboratories, you said they're close. Why has there been such a great expansion?
So it was, in large measure, essentially in whole, a response to the 2001 anthrax mailings. At the time of the 2001 anthrax mailings, it was understandable because it was expected here and elsewhere that the U.S. was under attack with a biological weapon from a foreign source. It was expected that biology would be put on a mobilization footing to address this threat. We expanded by a factor of 20 to 40. Now, more than a decade later, more than a decade after it has become absolutely clear that the 2001 anthrax mailings did not come from a foreign source, and after it has become clear that the investigation believes it came from within the U.S. biodefense establishment, we have the strange situation that we've expanded that establishment by a factor of 20 to 40 without reason and without reassessment.
And the risks are self-evident? Is that
the risks follow mathematically. When you increase the number of personnel by a factor of 20 to 40, particularly when you recruit people without prior experience, new to the field, you increase risks, and you increase those risks by a factor of 20 to 40 or more.
On those points, Mr. Kaufman, are you in agreement that we need to scale it back some?
I am not. I agree with GAO. I think that it's there's not enough information to make a decision to either back off or go up. We don't have a baseline. And I also would like to say that high containment laboratories are not built, the capacity of high containment laboratories are not built for the threats we just see today. They're built for the threats that we don't see coming around the corner tomorrow.
What about, let me switch gears and go and ask about the research implications, or the implications from research of re-engineering pathogens, such as the experiments by University of Wisconsin scientists that generated a virus similar to the 1918 influenza outbreak that killed tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands worldwide, and others ways to make H5N1 avian flu virus more contagious than ferrets. I mean, is this part of the expansion, or is this?
This is part of the expansion. This is work that is funded as biodefense research, and this is a prime example of the culture of hubris. This is work that should not be performed, flat and blank, should not be performed. In those cases where elements of this work are deemed essential, when the research information could be obtained in no other way, then this work should only be performed in a very limited number of institutions, perhaps one or two nationally.
For unlocked refrigerators and Ziploc bags, those days have to be over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I think it's important for us to investigate this incident involving the release of potentially viable anthrax on CDC's campus in Atlanta. When I was chairman of the Oversight Committee, we held hearings after the 2001 anthrax attacks. We looked at the safety of postal workers and the public in handling mail and the Postal Service and CDC's response to those attacks. We had hearings again in 2003 and 2005 where we found there were still gaps in biological detection of anthrax and in communicating test results and risks to the public. Those hearings showed why CDC's work on identifying and containing public health risks from these types of biological agents is so important. But this work can also pose risks, and that's why this oversight hearing is important. In 2009, when I was chairman of the full committee, we held a hearing on the proliferation of high containment biolabs and the lack of oversight over such facilities. Mr. Dingle also held a hearing in 2007, so this is not our first introduction to this subject. At our request, GAO, the Government Accountability Office, also looked into lab safety. GAO reported in a number of studies, one as recently as 2013, on the problems associated with the government's fragmented, piecemeal approach to these labs. No single agency has oversight over all high containment biolabs. There are no national standards for operation, and we have no record of how many labs even exist. And announced that it will remain closed until it is approved to reopen under safer conditions. These seem like appropriate interim steps until CDC can undertake a comprehensive safety review and ensure that the proper procedures and protocols are in place moving forward. Dr. Frieden, how long do you anticipate this moratorium lasting and the Bratt lab being closed?
The short answer to your question is as long as it takes to ensure that they can open safely. The longer answer is that there are some things that need to resume. For example, proficiency testing for select agents in the laboratory response network. And that's something that we will look at very carefully. But I'm committed that we will not open them until we can open them safely.
What steps are you taking to lift the moratorium and reopen the facilities? When will you know, or how will you know when it's safe to do so?
I've appointed Dr. Michael Bell, who's a top expert at CDC, not only in laboratory science, but also in safety. He works within the hospital infection control and safety unit of CDC to oversee a high-level working group reporting to me. And they will develop, in the next day or so, finalize criteria by which they will assess each of the laboratories. Then each laboratory will look at its own protocols and practices and determine whether they are validated, effective, and scientifically proven and implemented in a way that we can be sure they will be applied. And then each laboratory will apply to him for resumption and lifting of the moratorium. I will review his recommendations and ultimately approve laboratory by laboratory reopening of this process. I would just mention this is not a small thing. because many of our laboratories that have BSL-3 laboratories have adjacent BSL-2 laboratories, and much of their work has to be done in the BSL-2. So they inactivate in the BSL-3, then move it to the BSL-2. That work has all stopped at this point until we can ensure that we're doing it safely. And this is one of the things that really is a tipping point for improving the culture of safety at CDC.
You can be advised by counsel. Do you have a desire to be advised by counsel during testimony today?
That is correct.
You do have a counsel?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. Could you please raise your right hand and I'll swear you in? Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. You're now under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code.
For over 10 years, I have been providing biosafety training programs for individuals working in high containment laboratories. My background is in behavioral science, and I specialize in motivating individuals to behave and mitigate risks associated with infectious diseases.
I have to swear you in, but first ask you, when we're doing an investigative hearing, we take testimony under oath. Do you have any objections to testify under oath? And the chair will advise you, under the rules of the House and rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do you desire to be advised by counsel today? In that case, would you please rise and raise your right hand? I'll swear you in. You swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. You're now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code.
Thank you for inviting me to discuss the 2014 CDC anthrax incident and its implications. I am Board of Governors Professor of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Rutgers University and Laboratory Director at the Waxman Institute of Microbiology. I will discuss 3 topics. First, the 2014 CDC anthrax incident. Second, broader biosafety and biosecurity issues in CDC bioweapons agents laboratories, also known as select agent laboratories. And 3, broader biosafety and biosecurity issues at the more than 1,000 other government, academic, and corporate select agent laboratories across the U.S. that are regulated by the CDC. My assessments are based on information in published CDC, HHS OIG, USDA OIG, and GAO documents, published press reports, and on my knowledge of biosafety and biosecurity standards for work with bacterial pathogens. I turn first to the 2014 CDC anthrax incident. I note that the 2014 CDC anthrax incident did not involve one violation in one laboratory, but instead involved an entire series of violations. The 2014 CDC anthrax incident involved multiple violations of biosafety and biosecurity recommendations in each of 3 different CDC laboratories. There were at least 7 distinct violations in total. Had any of 3 violations in one CDC laboratory not occurred, the incident would not have occurred. Had any of 4 violations in 2 other CDC laboratories not occurred, the impact of the incident would have been mitigated. I note further that the incident reprised nearly exactly a 2004 incident. In the 2004 incident, workers at Southern Research Institute in Frederick, Maryland, used an inappropriate procedure to inactivate a sample of anthrax bacteria, used an inappropriate procedure to verify inactivation, and sent the putatively inert but actually viable anthrax bacteria to Oakland Children's Hospital, where 8 persons were exposed before learning that the anthrax bacteria were viable. The CDC, as the agency with regulatory responsibility for select agent work relevant to human health, investigated the 2004 Oakland anthrax incident, and in 2005 issued a report on the incident. The 2005 CDC report included revised biosafety and biosecurity recommendations both for laboratories that prepare and provide inactivated anthrax bacteria and for laboratories that receive and use those inactivated anthrax bacteria. Had the CDC implemented the recommendations in its own 2005 report, the 2014 CDC anthrax incident could not have occurred, but the CDC did not implement the recommendations in its 2005 report. The fact that the CDC in 2014 made exactly the same errors that had been made in the 2004 Oakland anthrax incident shows that the CDC did not learn from that incident.
But let me just put this in context. I don't know if you were here when we gave our opening statements. I've been on this subcommittee since 1997. And I've got to tell you that the reason why we're so concerned here is because this kind of practice keeps happening over and over again.
The message consistently is that these agents require respect. and they must be handled with respect. And before any experiment, that risk-benefit assessment must occur.
And if one of your personnel failed to follow those protocols, what would you do to them?
Depending on the nature of the failure, they would face consequences up to and including termination.
Okay, and we don't see that pattern taking place at CDC.
We haven't seen evidence for it.
Okay, do you think that CDC is in need of a major correction, and do you have advice for CDC on what that correction would be?
Well, many of the things that we heard Dr. Frieden suggest will be undertaken at the CDC are precisely the steps that are required at the CDC. The question is whether this time will be different from the previous time and the time before that and the time before that.
And if they did not do that, I think probably, according to what you've said, you would terminate the whole bunch.
Again, I'm not sure that in this particular case, personnel action won't be sufficient to resolve the issue. This issue is institutional and organizational.
Correct.
They cannot have the regulatory authority to regulate themselves. It simply doesn't work. It doesn't work in many areas of human endeavor, and it definitely doesn't work in this area.
Mr. Kaufman, anything to add to that?
I continue to stand by my belief that any type of, and my conviction, because over the last 10 years I have traveled the world, including several federal labs in the United States, and I have asked scientists to please report laboratory accidents and incidents so we have a chance to learn from them. And if we take this chance now and turn it into a punitive aspect against scientists that make unintentional injuries, it's well known that punishment does three things. It builds resentment, it teaches no new behavior, and it hides true behavior. And so if we're going to make decisions that are going to decrease risk in science, we better consider how we address incidents and accidents before doing so. Punitive actions, in my opinion, are not a way to go. Certainly not against a scientist that unintentionally makes a mistake. If a scientist willingly, and there are scientists that do that, go against SOPs, that's a completely different job issue than a scientist that is doing their job within a culture and does not go outside of the SOP that's provided to them.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I got a comment on that, Mr. Kaufman. It builds resentment. You got to be kidding me. You telling me these people with PhDs do not understand that anthrax is dangerous? Are you kidding me? They need more training? You making your statement the CDC anthrax lab incident was also a result of training failure? Biosafety training for scientists working with high containment facilities consists of multiple phases, blah, blah, blah. Are you kidding me? Are you making excuses for these scientists? If they don't understand that anthrax is used for a weapon, its spores can kill people, it killed people and harmed people at the U.S. Capitol, then they shouldn't be working there. And it sounds like you're saying they need more training. Boo-hoo! This is a bad situation. And I don't think you understand the seriousness of this, and it sounds like you're making excuses. Look at this. Washington Post, today's cartoon. You think the employees at CDC are proud of this? Ha, ha, ha. It's funny. No, it's not. This is tragic. It could have been lethal for people. And I hear you telling Ms. Blackburn that we're going to build resentment. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't buy that at all.
May I comment? Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Murphy. I, again, am not defending what's going on with CDC. In fact, I've said that I'm disappointed, even as a former CDC.
Disappointed is not the right word. You should find this to be abhorrent. Any words other than yes or no. Was it wrong or not wrong? We can make excuses for, Mary Barra sat here from GM and she said this was wrong. There's no question about it. Dr. Frieden said this was wrong. There's no gray zone in this. I don't get it. I'll let you respond to that.
I appreciate that. I know the individuals involved, and when I say training is needed and training is a solution, there are several phases of training, and on-the-job specific training, which includes SOP verification, is needed for scientists, which have been mentioned in previous panel aspects as well. I'm not making light of this situation. I'm not making light of this situation at all. I'm simply saying that if we choose to punish people who come forward when they make a mistake,
That's different. I'm not talking about
that's what I'm saying.
people. That's different. We want people to be willing to do that.
Thank you. That's.
But I thought that you were saying here, and I think it is in your statements here too, they need more training.
They need.
You don't need
on-the-job
training
specific
to know that this is bad. When you put anthrax in a Ziploc bag or any other pathogen, you don't need training to know that. So I've gone over. I want Mr. Griffith, you're recognized.
That is subjective.